I think obviously we've seen a lot of change in the past 2 years with the pandemic and people working from home and everything else. I think Space 48 is actually a completely virtual business. So just be interesting to get your thoughts on that whole sort of move to hybrid working. I know we've got some clients who have done a little bit of hybrid, and I think there's definitely some questions about how do you keep the culture going, how do you onboard people and that sort of thing. What's your experience been so far?
Yeah, it's been fascinating, and again, where we are and where it will end, I think we're still in that whole sort of journey. But just not talking about any of the business specifically, but just talking about looking around generally. When I'm going to have meetings, you go into offices now, and they just aren't the place where you want to be. There's sort of the half empty, or even worse, and they've just got no buzz in them. So it's and I tend to work a lot in sort of, I suppose, agencies, technology businesses, and those buildings are sort of cool and buzzy and exciting places to be. It was part of the big attraction for young people to work in those kind of environments. And actually now they're pretty, they're not a great place to be. And what people are really struggling with is the fact that obviously that's an overhead. And then you've got the fact that to make that work as an office, you need everybody to come back in. And trying to enforce that is very difficult. And then, you've got this thing of that people love this hybrid nature now. So in lots of ways, they love the flexibility of it, but they actually get a lot done. And so the businesses where people do come in, the nature of what they do when they're in the office has changed. It's much more about communicating with other people, but they like to work back at home to get the work done. And I've worked that way for years, so I absolutely get that. But it does really change. The sort of the whole function. I think people now we're getting back to a bit of hybrid working. I find some real challenges on that, and you've got people who are typically coming in 2 or 3 days a week. Surprisingly, not Monday or Friday. They tend to be worked at home. But quite often, the same members of teams aren't even coming in on the same days. And I think the worst situation you can have from certainly a meeting point of view is when you've got hybrid meeting. I think they are just hopeless.
Interesting.
So and this is what certainly Space 48 have been fantastic at this. They've adopted a very sort of remote first kind of operating model in the way everything is done. And so, with our meetings, and we do get together for certain meetings. The rule is it's either all remote or all face to face, and anything in between doesn't really hit it. It doesn't really work. And even with technologies, I don't know if you come across the OWL technology, where you can sit a device in the middle of your table, and effectively whoever's speaking, it will focus the camera and microphone on them. So to the people working remotely, they would see, that individual speaking as you would on a remote meeting. But again, that's not perfect either, and you still don't. You've got what's going on in the room, and then what you've got going on the screen is very different. So I think for me, the key is to have that remote first model, and then to look at how you sort of enhance that with face-to-face meetings or coming into an office. And that changes the role of what an office might be. And that's what people are starting to think about, having a smaller space, having a more of a drop-in space, a meeting space, and using that space differently. This goes from people from agencies to banks, are thinking around this. It's a cross sector. And I think your point on culture is really, really interesting, and I think that will depend a lot on the nature of the business and maybe even the nature of the function in a business. The kind of businesses that I'm working with at the moment, there's quite a lot of software engineers in those businesses, and to an extent, they are quite happy to work remotely and work quite in a very focused way when they're coding. They need interaction, obviously, but they compare that group to a sort of client services function, which are much more sort of socially oriented.
Yeah,
and they really need that getting together. Really struggle without that. It's like their air. They need that to function. And so I think it's different. And I think what companies do well is to recognise the difference between teams and to almost manage it at a team level how people work, rather than sort of say, as a company we're going to be like this, and try to do everything on an all company basis. So when all company remote meetings aren't a great thing.
no.
If you get it into manageable team meetings, that can work really, really well. And I think then the other one is just the engagement across the business, and to get what people like Space 48 do brilliantly. They have got an incredibly engaged team of people that are right across the business, working together on all sorts of initiatives right across the business. And that's really, I think it's quite unique of what I've seen.
Yeah.
And they're doing that remotely, and they are very, if you look at all of the sort of metrics of how staff satisfaction, if you like, all measure very, very highly. Staff attrition is incredibly low. Very, very engaged workforce. Culture is very strong. Culture probably has changed as a consequence of it being remote, but still really good. And I think the getting together is really changing. There's a far greater social element to those get-togethers than there perhaps was previously. There's still work, but the social element of that is really, really important. And
I think that's really interesting what you said about remote first. I think that's one of the things that I've seen businesses struggle with. I think we've adapted our way we operate here. I think that either remote or in person is a really interesting approach. I think that certainly, I find it more difficult if there is a mixture. Some people that are in the room and some people that are not in the room. I think that doesn't really work for me from a personal perspective. I think that is quite hard to manage. And I do think we're seeing it from a candidate perspective. It's probably in the top 3 questions a candidate asks now is how much of it is office based. Roll back 2 years and that was never a question that anybody asked. And it is a attraction and retention issue. Because some people will say it's 5 days a week hybrid. Some people say it's got to be 3 days minimum in the office a week. And the other thing I've seen, which I'm not sure how it works, is it's almost micromanaging remotely. So a morning check-in, a lunchtime check-in, by video, an afternoon check-in by video. And I kind of feel that that's doesn't necessarily build the trust and culture that you're trying to do with hybrid working. It kind of feels like that defeats the object to a certain extent.
Yeah, and that's really interesting you mentioned that. I mean, when I set up the original, my business was J-Wing. When I set that up back in '99, the experiment was, at that point, could you run a business on trust rather than control? Having worked for large corporates, which were very, very control managed, and that was fascinating, and here we are again, and that was a sort of a remote model at the time for that business in a with a very poor technology. And the same thing's true now, and I think people who are trying to micromanage remote workforces, they're on a hiding to nothing. That you can't do it that way. It's got to be there's got to be a level of trust there, and you've got to be able to manage on that base. I think that's where people with very high control management styles are struggling with this whole thing, because it demands a different approach.
Yeah, and I think it becomes a bit more, back to the discussion on data, really. Are you measuring productivity? Are you outcomes driven rather than, using other metrics to drive whether people are being productive? And I know businesses that were very, very skeptical about staff working from home who now have fully embraced it, because actually found the staff are more productive by having the mix of hybrid working. But I think it has got to be managed in that right way and get the culture. I think, again, interesting the point you make about almost doing it at a team level So you've kind of got the overall company culture, but let it settle at a team level, and how those teams interact, I think is a really interesting point.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that that's being talked about a lot at the moment is that there's been this sense that, you know, whereas productivity grew when people started working remotely, there's a view that actually productivity's got a lot worse of late. And actually, I think that's probably the hybrid model, because I think it is more difficult to make that work. You know, all remote or all in, it's you know, one or the other, but in the middle it's quite challenging. And I think, you know, so that's the challenge that people are having to sort of take on at the moment. And we'll see where that goes. You know,
absolutely. I mean, it doesn't feel like it's going away. I mean, I've worked in professional services, and I've got former colleagues who say to me that, you know, they now work in businesses where they physically don't have enough desks for everyone if they're all in. So literally not everyone can be in the office anymore. So are we going to go back to a world where people start taking more office space? I'm not sure I see that happening. So inevitably that will lead to people being more flexible in where and how they work. I think the one thing that I'm not sure how it will work, and I know some people are doing it, is where you've particularly got at a very senior level, a board level, where you've got people working virtually but very geographically dispersed. And you know, we've said to a few clients recently when they've been recruiting, you know, either a CFO or a CMO, and they've quite glibly said, well, they can be based anywhere these days, can't they? And I kind of think, well, can they? You know, if the business is, you know, going through a difficult time or whatever, I still think there's that sort of, you want your senior team relatively close at hand. I don't know, perhaps that's me just being old-fashioned, but I do
get that. I do get that, and I think it is when you are in a difficult spot. There's no doubt it's getting together is one of the key things that creates, well, lots of things, but creates the energy and that sort of spirit of actually sorting whatever that issue out. And if you didn't get together, you just wouldn't get that same feel, I think. And but I mean, you know, you do see I think in large corporates quite often that was a model. Forget the pandemic, it was a model that you had before, and the only problem of that is that people didn't really, and particularly people work for them, there wasn't a good sense of belonging. And you quite often, these businesses, it didn't gel in the same way. So I think there's definitely something in what you're saying, but it is going to be that mix. And I think, you know, those senior teams need to get together just as much as some of the other teams, both to work together a bit, but also to sort of socialize and have all those other aspects of working together, being that team.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, we operate in an environment, certainly in our Manchester office, which is, you know, we've got our own office space, but we work on a floor where there are other technology businesses, there's other service businesses, and you can tell by the levels of seats that are available on different days that clearly everyone, you know, Tuesday, Wednesdays, Thursdays, the office is very busy, Mondays and Fridays a bit less so, but I can't see that changing. I think that's, you know, that's going to be here for certainly the near term, I suspect. So really interesting. Well, very much appreciate your thoughts on that, Martin, and appreciate your time this morning. So thanks ever so much. It's been great to chat.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. I enjoyed it too.